Hello, welcome to our roundtable on Indigenomics and reconciliation. Our panelists are here, Caroline Hilton and Karen Joseph. We had a great session earlier this morning that covered this topic, and we had many questions that came in during the session. What I'd like to do is I'd like to structure it so that we can get to as many of those questions that were asked as we can, because they do cover a number of similar themes. And then what we'll do is we'll open it up, or we can, as we are talking, we encourage you to insert your questions into the chat, and we'll get to as many of those as possible. We're just going to ask, because we're expecting a lot of people on this session, to just we're keeping the mics off. You can put your video on, that's fine, but I'd like to be able to get to as much of this as we can. So without further ado, let's get to our first group of questions. And the theme is generally about engagement with Indigenous communities. They could be with Indigenous governments or Indigenous businesses. So some of the questions we have here: do you have examples of economic partnerships on joint ventures with municipalities and Indigenous organizations? There's also a point here that came in referencing some work that's happening in the Nanaimo and Snuneymuxw area around a task force on economic development. The challenge is, because there are many partners involved with this effort, the question is, how do we ensure that it is worth the time and effort and engagement from the Snuneymuxw First Nation? Because there's lots of interest there, but how do we make that a constructive engagement? And another similar question is, really more specifically, what is the most respectful way to show that we want to begin conversations to engage? Do we go through band council? Do we approach First Nation businesses directly? What is the most effective way to do it? So anyway, there's a couple of different questions in there, but I wanted to group those because it's very much in the realm of what is the best way to engage with Indigenous communities. So Karen, maybe we can start with you on that one, and we'll go from there.
Thank you. I think there's a lot of ways to engage with Indigenous communities. Many of them have been cited in here. I think the question to ask is why. So, for instance, with the task force, what is the purpose of the task force, and how would that benefit Indigenous people? And is that mandate already set, or is there an opportunity to have people come in and co-develop the purpose of that task force? Keeping in mind that within Indigenous communities, certainly within Indigenous leadership, you've got 5-6 people doing the job of city council and the administration and all of those other things, and they're holding like 5 or 6 different portfolios at the same time. And you're asking them to contribute their limited resources, both time and money, to an opportunity that may or may not benefit them. So I think first and foremost, those are some of the awarenesses that people have to have. I think the other piece of it is just in building relationships, getting to know your neighbors, getting to know, rather than coming with, can you do this for me, as your first introduction, how about, bringing something over? Hey, I saw you guys working, and, just the same way you would approach a neighbor that you don't know, and sort of building those relationships first. I think that there are many ways. Many people would say, go to the council. That's one way, if you have something very specific that you want to have in there. I think when it comes to business development, that's typically not what council does. You typically want to go to somebody who's responsible for that economic development center. There's oftentimes coalitions that represent a number of different communities within an area. So there's lots of different ways to do it, but I think first and foremost, before you go there, what is the purpose, and where's the reciprocity in it? And keeping in mind, most of the people, there's always it presents a wonderful opportunity for compensation, and meaningful compensation, as opposed to what we would call a handshake to come and participate in that. So those would be some the top of my mind. But always everybody's thing is let's go to council, and it's like you and 500 other people want to talk to council, and so is this really worthy of that, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, and just on that point, I mean, a clear example of just the diversity and complexity of Indigenous communities is the Wet'suwet'en example, I think, where, there was a sense that, when it comes to energy projects and so forth, when you're engaging with councils or elected councils, you are engaging with one aspect of the community, but there's also, again, there's the hereditary chiefs, there's all kinds of different other aspects to Indigenous communities that have to be considered. Caroline, your response?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a fantastic question. I just wanted to draw an example. I was out with the Shamanis, the Stamanis First Nation out in Ladysmith a couple of years ago, and they were having their community's very first economic development open house. And what I noticed was that it was super exciting for the community. They had all these invitations out to people that wanted to do business with them. And it was really this fantastic demonstration of this community building their economic presence. So at the beginning of the open house, the chief provided a couple remarks, and it was a jam-packed room. There were so many people in there. All wanting to just understand what this looked like of doing business with the nation. So the mayor at the time was invited up to the podium next, and he said basically that, the city of, or the town of Ladysmith had been established as a town around 1904. And he's like, I think it was around 2016 when this open house was. He's like, not a single time over this period has a mayor crossed the line onto the reserve. He's like, I'm here and I'm ready to do business. It's time to cross the fabricated lines that keep us apart. And that is all he said. Like 3 sentences, he's like, we're ready to do business. We're ready to talk. And I think that's an excellent demonstration of we need to remove the fabrication of the concept of the reserve line and really build relationships. So it's not just setting meetings with chief and council, but communicating, whether it's a company, what is your company about? It can be Indigenous procurement systems. It can be inviting to open houses within the sector that the nation is invited to. I really, in my work, because I work both regionally and nationally, is I really question, local economic development organizations, national organizations of really, what is your Indigenous presence? If everyone at the table looks slightly familiar to each other and all kind of look the same, you should really consider a diversity and inclusion approach and get uncomfortable with that. Call to account. We kind of all look the same here. We probably are missing people that don't look like us. And I think that's really where we're at in a larger discussion around diversity and inclusion. But that first realization of if everybody looks like you, then you're probably not a very inclusive table, and it's actually is very much time to address that. So at board tables, at regional tables, sectoral tables, all of those provide wonderful opportunities to examine what is the degree of an inclusion and what other conversations could we be having? What invitations can we extend to the local nation for participation and economic visibility? Thank you.
Thank you. So Karen, this is a specific question for you, and it arises from our session earlier. So you were referring to a community in which there was a study and pilot being done. I think there was just a question as to which community were you referring to?
We were actually working with the village of Alert Bay and Numgees. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's good. Yeah, I
thought.
So.
I also wanted to sort of follow up on what Caroline was saying.
Yep.
Because it has to do with the economic disparity differences that exist when you're inviting people to the table. And so many of the people that are at that table have employment or are in a position where their participation at that table is sort of covered. And lots of times within Indigenous community, if you have somebody participating at that table, keeping in mind they have multiple other hats, or they may not even have a hat that allows them to be there. So really just think about the compensation of that. And that's about equity. It's not about they're worth more than you and you don't get the, you know, that kind of thing. It's about making sure that there's a value add for them to be able to come and share that wisdom with you, as opposed to a checkbox initiative, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The next couple of questions, they're pretty specific, but I think important in terms of moving forward with this. So the first question is, which agency or jurisdiction is responsible for issuing a business license for an Indigenous business operating on reserve? So that's the first question. And the second one is there a directory listing Indigenous businesses on Vancouver Island? Either of you.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah.
I would reference the recent establishment of a new organization on the BC regional scene, which is Indigenous Economic Development Corporation Society. And I think that is where we're going to start seeing a little bit more data. I've looked into the data sets around the economy here on the island from an Indigenous perspective, and really it leaves a lot of questions. You know, how many Indigenous businesses are there? What is the capital requirements here? And that with that realization, it becomes ever more important to understand and establish the structures to engage Indigenous businesses.
Thank you. Karen?
I think very similar to what Caroline is saying.
Yeah. I do know that the Métis Nation has a business directory for BC. So, I mean, I think there's a few places, but you know, I think that's a good question to keep pursuing. Might be something VIEA could help with as well.
I wanted to add to that. There's two other groups that come to mind. I believe that there's a new partnership concept between the Nanaimo Chamber of Commerce and the Nanaimo and local nations that will also identify mid-island Indigenous businesses potentially. And then I also wanted to highlight the work of the South Island Prosperity Group, which I think, again, is an excellent demonstration of aligning Indigenous business interest with regional players and a regional context. And then I'm less familiar if any of that information exists on the West Coast, on the New Channel side, or on the Northeast side of the island as well. But it definitely points to the direction of needing to understand the number and increasing the visibility of Indigenous businesses here on the island for sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Actually, the only other thing I can think about is in terms of the licensing, there isn't a standardized way that's approached within Indigenous communities, and many of the people that have businesses within communities just sort of word of mouth. Yeah.
Good to know. This question, how can the public library support economic reconciliation?
This is a fun one. The libraries were really, really critical in getting out the word around reconciliation, and actually we're active partners in that here within Vancouver and in the Lower Mainland. So I think that, you know, when you're hosting your evenings or your events that libraries always host, you know, there's an opportunity to invite local entrepreneurs into that space, or local business people, and just kind of setting up exactly what you've done here, you know, procuring some books, having a display where all of that is, and sort of educating the librarians about what resources are available. You know, there's so much that libraries can do. I had no idea how much of a driver libraries were in terms of community involvement. It was quite amazing, actually.
Caroline?
I don't have too much more to add to that. I think Karen covered that very well, but just focusing on the content, that there's a broad spectrum of content that isn't just kind of socioeconomic gap related or trauma related, but also builds up stories of resilience, success, and business and economy. So having a really solid spread of content that is a place for citizens to engage with educational learning. Another aspect I would just add to that is that aligning content to Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. So whether it's justice or education or a place where Canadians can access information around the state of the Indigenous relationship nationally, the development of Canada, but really also organizing content to be accessible to the reader that is asking questions around reconciliation and wanting to know more information, so that it's easily identified to understand, you know, a question of, you know, why are there so many Indigenous peoples in the jails? Building content that supports that understanding, building content that deconstructs the myths of Indigenous people being a fiscal burden, going right into the Constitution and context that really is responsive to Canadian learning. And that is one way I see as well that libraries can play a huge leadership role in reconciliation. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to go back to the point about a business directory. So the Greater Victoria Harbour Authority has an Indigenous business directory, and they are working to expand it with support from the Victoria Chamber, as well as from the South Island Prosperity Project. So thank you for that, Bruce. That's good information to know. The next question, have either of you been involved in the social enterprise model for Indigenous entrepreneurs, and would that be a good fit?
For sure, I'll take a stab at that. Yeah. I wanted to highlight one of my respected colleagues with the Raven Capital Partnership Group that is really looking at accessible capital to the social Indigenous entrepreneur. And I think it's a fantastic model, and ones that can be engaged easily with from a financial or capital perspective, that seeing Indigenous economic or social impact as designed through businesses, I think is an excellent example of the types of entrepreneurs that are being supported within that type of a structure. So I advise Raven Capital Partners and support that evolution of getting capital to these types of entrepreneurs. I think that's really a new model of realizing pathways of financeability, as well as balancing that with the concept of Indigenous impact.
All right, Karen?
Yeah, actually, we're doing quite a bit of work in that as we're looking at innovative ways to impact the economy within Indigenous communities and externally as well. So the B Corp movement, there's a whole bunch of different places that you can do that. But I think one of the challenges is that even the innovation space is targeted around a certain perspective of innovation. And so there's another institution called the Turtle Island Institute who is looking at developing innovation practices that are reflective of Indigenous communities. And so I think, if people have the opportunity to support organizations like that, even if you can't get I think those are some ways that we need to be supporting the evolution of Indigenous economics within not only the province but within Canada, because those are groups that are really doing some amazing work, including us, Reconciliation Canada. We're an Indigenous-led charitable organization. We're not actually any extension of the Canadian government, which is a big challenge that we have. But I also think that when we're looking at those kinds of processes, really being open to new ways of doing things, like really different ways. So for instance, we're building a leadership program, at Reconciliation Canada, that's actually going to be targeting Indigenous women. And the way that we're doing it is, rather than having it as something on top of what they're already doing, we're trying to recognize them for the wisdom and the practices that they're going to be bringing. And so there's a compensatory component to all of that that allows them to participate in that. So there's really, really different ways of doing that. And I may be wrong, but last time I checked with Raven Capital, they're a second stage business incubator. They're not you know, if you're just wanting to start a business, which is, as Carol Ann and I were saying, you know, if people have the opportunity to access resources in that $5,000 to $10,000 range, you would see dramatic differences in business. And if there was somebody that could support them in the actual creation of accounting, their accounting techniques and their books and all of that, because, you know, we're great entrepreneurs. Not all great entrepreneurs are great accountants. And you know, if we have organizations that can support them in that way, you're actually leveling up those businesses and providing them with a much better opportunity for success.
That sounds like a good opportunity for our sponsor, CPA BC, to partner on that. So next question is, with respect to Indigenous economic development typically relies on natural resources or the use of reserve lands for business activities. What are your thoughts on how Indigenous communities with less access to natural resources or reserve lands can play a larger role in the economy outside or off reserve?
First of all, it's important to address the myth of reserve lands, because the function and structure of reserve lands was, in its original formation, a process of economic isolation from the rest of Canada and the development of Canada's economy. The intention of the reserve lands was to isolate the Indians from the resources. So I think that legal construct of this country, where the Indigenous leadership has put Canada's reality, where I read this message of, we need to understand as a country that we're in a legal and an economic relationship, that there's too much focus on the legal. We're constantly fighting the natives. That's not really the perspective that is conducive to Indigenous economic design. So legal courts have undone this postage stamp concept of the Indian reserves as the foundation of the Indigenous economy, and has expanded that to the requirement of on the traditional territories of nations. So it's important to understand the context of accessibility within that reserve construct, and also understand the evolution of the legal environment, that nations' reality and existence was not limited to the establishment of the reserve, that actual our economic strength and presence is best reflected on our traditional territories. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. I think if I think about what's defined as a reserve from where I come from, it's probably a little bit bigger than a football field. But if you actually look at the traditional territories from which I come from, there is significant landmass that would be considered our territories, because we don't have treaty here in British Columbia typically. So I think as we're looking at that's a really important question in terms of licensing, in terms of recognizing Indigenous businesses, in terms of taxation, all of those kinds of things come into that conversation. The other interesting thing that I'm noticing that's happening quite a bit here in the Lower Mainland is this idea of cities, municipalities, or businesses within those cities actually transferring lands back to Indigenous communities and having a process for those lands to becoming absorbed within the construct of those communities, and then taking that another step further, allowing creating significant loaning relationships that allow them to then build upon those lands. So you'll see this anywhere you go across Canada, it doesn't matter. If it's a poor community, all of the businesses are across the street off of the Indigenous land. And if it's a community that has lots of land in a really, really good space, there's all kinds of what I call box businesses renting the land at really, really low rates. So you'll see Walmarts and Staples and all of these other things conglomerated on this one piece of land, but the actual share that the Indigenous community gets access to is very, very limited, and it really will probably allow them enough to clean up the mess once those businesses move somewhere else. So, you know, getting access to that and having meaningful access to that are two different things. So I think, you know, we need to be flipping the conversation is how are we building wealth within those communities, not how are we creating jobs within those communities, and how are we creating some kind of a sustainable economy that actually benefits both? Because I don't believe it's an either or. I think that's a significant myth that goes on here in Canada. The reality is that the majority is that Indigenous people contribute the majority to rural wealth.
Yeah,
they are the major contributor, and yet we don't have the sustainability of that wealth because of the way the systems are set up right now. So I think there's just so many opportunities there for people that have, you know, a different way of thinking to come in and start trying different approaches to things. You know, like what we did with Numgis was, there was this whole issue of training here and businesses here. They have a whole waterfront full of empty stores, and there's this exorbitant fees to build a business because they're trying to create taxes. And all of the people that can create the businesses are Indigenous people that are living on the reserve, but they don't have enough to pay the taxes. And it's just, so you just sit down and go, okay, we'll waive the taxes, we'll waive this, we'll do this. You know, there's ways that you can very simply pull all of those things together, but they're based on a trusting relationship, right? So we go back to our first question of building a relationship, to have a relationship, not to get something, with the local communities, and then seeing what are the best ways that you can weave together your different strengths, because ultimately everybody benefits when we do that.
so thank you for that, and a lot of great detail. I'll just point out we have about 2 more minutes left. If you look in the chat, a few of our participants have added some resources for accessing capital and business advice that's open to Indigenous and non-Indigenous entrepreneurs. So take a look at that before we end the session. I just will ask one more question and then we will need to wrap it up. So what are your thoughts around using the concept of the purpose of business in driving the well-being of people being applied to the global economy? Do you see a fit for this within the concept of the work towards shared ownership of global tech companies through the creation of global tech cooperatives or taxation, and the provision of a universal social divide? So that's a very complex question that you'll need to answer in 1 minute.
That is, I don't know who gave that question, but call me afterwards. That's actually part of what we're trying to do with some of the leadership that we're building, because all of that is based on a shared value about what is the purpose of economy. And you get shared values like Caroline and I were talking about. Namuyut, we're all one, is a value that's shared across Indigenous nations globally around the world. So we have a shared value system that already exists everywhere in the world that has some some responsibility to the lands that exist around the world. And it's a network that nobody's ever tried to engage in this conversation before. So, and as I said, you know, you'll see here, it's predominantly women. It's not people that are in the leadership positions. Typically, it's women that are working within those communities. So if you really are interested in that, like, give me a call.
That's great. Great offer. Caroline, I'll give you the last word.
I think that was a heck of an ending question. I would really encourage you to connect with the work of the BC First Nations Technology Council, who is doing amazing work of building Indigenous technology capacity, access to connectivity, and building a context of technology connectivity and the relationship to the Indigenous economy. Before we can even connect that to global growth, what becomes important to understand, I think there was a recent study that identified close to 2/3 of northern-based Indigenous communities are without access to reliable internet. So before we even begin speaking to economic growth and design, actually understanding infrastructure deficits and accessibility locally. So even examining that, of what that looks like here on Vancouver Island, becomes an important discussion for sure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So much more to discuss on this, and not enough time. But as I said in the session, I think this is something that certainly from VIEA, and we were talking offline with our speakers, that we'll want to carry on this conversation in some other format or activity going forward. So thank you very much. And we welcome your participation from our participants as well on this very important topic. So thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Karen. Sepka Siem. Marcy, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.